And then later on in this hour, former Undersecretary of State James Glassman, he'd like to see healthy banks get out from under the government's grip. When will that happen? That's coming up. Secretary Tim Geithner declaring this morning that the Treasury will offer smaller banks more capital through the TARP program. Our next guest agrees with this move, but he worries about too much government control. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Jim Glassman. He is the former Undersecretary of State and president of the World Growth Institute. You agree with the move. You're not concerned about the government's having too much control over banks large and small, Jim?
No, I'm very concerned about government having control over banks large and small. Absolutely. You know, I think what's happened here is it is becoming clearer and clearer which are the healthy banks and which are the non-healthy banks. And, you know, I think that the non-healthy banks need help, whether they're community banks or large banks. I think that's helpful to the whole system. What bothers me is, first of all, the healthy banks that want to repay the TARP funds so that America's taxpayers can have their money back are not at this point allowed to. It's kind of outrageous at this point. 15% returns we're talking about. Companies like Northern Trust, Goldman Sachs, American Express want to repay the TARP and they're not able to do it. I absolutely have concerns about the control that many politicians want to exert, and one of the reasons, perhaps, that some of these banks are not allowed to repay is because politicians don't want to give up that control.
Jim, I want to get your reaction to something that we just had reported today from Judicial Watch. You know, they obtained the documents from Treasury Secretary Paulson's meeting with a lot of these executives, and it basically quotes him as saying, you have to take the money. I mean, if you don't take the TARP money, we're going to force you to take the TARP money, so just play ball. Your reaction to that, Jim?
Well, I think that was known before. I mean, I'm glad there's new evidence of it, but banks were forced to take the TARP money because in the government's analysis, at any rate, if you had banks that were not taking it, then investors or depositors would get nervous about the banks that were taking it. Well, now, that seems to me on its face ridiculous.
But Jim, but the government would come back with you and say, well, we need to have some control over taxpayer money. We can't just hand them money so they can go over to California and run a spa for the weekend.
Well, look, the government is deeply involved in all aspects of American life. For example, the government pays contractors to build roads. That doesn't mean that the government can then set the compensation of the president of a contracting company. But what you see here is more and more government control. And I think a perfect example is what happened in the Chrysler bankruptcy, where pressure may have been put on large banks. I'm not saying it was, but it's certainly those banks were in a position to be pressured by the government because they had TARP funds, whereas other creditors, hedge funds, the government could not pressure them other than orally because they didn't have their hooks in them. Mm-hmm. So all I'm saying is that I really think that we need to be extremely wary about government control that comes along with help such as the TARP. Well, and as I say, banks want to repay the TARP. They ought to be allowed to do it.
Yeah, no, actually, Jim, I agree with you on that point. But let me ask your opinion about the bank side of it. Do you think that banks, so far from what you know, have adequately used TARP funding to their advantage, to the taxpayers' advantage?
Well, I think the TARP funding has helped many banks get over a very difficult period. And, you know, some of those banks are still rather unhealthy, but many of them are healthy. Many of them, you know, as you said earlier, didn't want to take the TARP funding in the first place, and they are ready to repay. You know, they've been in the credit markets, they've been in the equity markets. Northern Trust and Goldman Sachs alone have raised $7 billion. We see Bank of America has just raised $7 billion. They're raising money. They are healthy, and not only that, but in my opinion, when the government begins to get out of this business, we're going to see confidence return as far as the credit markets are concerned.
Yeah, well, we're going to leave it there. That's a great point to go with. Jim Glassman, former Undersecretary of State, president of the World Growth Institute. Jim, thank you very much. Great perspective,
Thank you,
sir.
Cheryl. Thanks.